Hey guys, it's Mrs. Olenichek, and today we're going to talk about the digestive system. So big picture, what do animals and where animals need to be alive? We need energy, and we get that energy by breaking down food in the mitochondria, which is an organelle that's found in your cells. We also need oxygen for something called aerobic cellular respiration, which is really the best way of getting food, energy out of your food. And so we get the food by eating, and we get the oxygen by breathing and transporting in our red blood cells. We also need to replace damaged tissues, grow, kind of maintain homeostasis, and that requires raw materials. Again, we get most of those raw materials from our food. So amino acids, which are used to build proteins, sugars that we use for energy or to build carbohydrates, fats that are also really important for energy, along with other structural functions, and nucleotides, which are how we store genetic information. And we need energy in order to accomplish that synthesis, because remember, when you're building things, you have to put in energy. So one really important thing that we need to do is get and use food. So let's look at some vocabulary here. Ingestion is taking in food. Digestion is breaking that food down. Now you have mechanical digestion, which is where you're physically breaking it up into smaller pieces. So like chewing is an example of mechanical digestion. And then there's chemical digestion, where you're not just having smaller pieces of a carbohydrate, that's where you're actually breaking a large starch into the sugars, or a protein into amino acids. Chemical digestion is going to require enzymes. And remember, those are proteins that help reactions occur by lowering activation energy. Once you've digested, so you've broken things down into smaller pieces, both physically and molecularly, I don't know if that's a word, you then need to absorb those nutrients. So they need to pass through cell membranes so that they can be transported by your circulatory system. This is important. It's important that they're small enough so that they can easily pass, and we can usually transport a lot of things by diffusion, which is where you go from high to low concentration. But there's also stuff that will actively transport, so we'll use energy to transport it across the cell membrane. And that's either because it's large or because we're trying to move it from an area where it's in lower concentration to higher concentration. And then last is elimination. So this is where food that wasn't absorbed, you get rid of, and that's basically pooping. Here you have an example of intracellular digestion, and that's just digestion within a single cell. And below that you have extracellular digestion, and this is where the food is digested and then absorbed into the cell. We have extracellular digestion for the most part. We, luckily, unlike the Hydra, we have two openings. We have a mouth and an anus. However, if you look at the Hydra in that diagram, it only has one. So its mouth and anus are the same thing. So if you look at the human digestive system, and this is a diagram showing most of the major organs, one thing to remember is that you are a big tube. It's a long tube from mouth to anus, and food goes in and travels through this tube with some accessory organs dumping in enzymes and other chemicals, and then you absorb out what you need, and then what isn't absorbed is passed as feces or poop. But it really is a big tube from mouth to anus. So you go mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, out. All right, so we'll start in the mouth. Here you have mechanical digestion, and that's just chewing. You use your teeth to break up food into smaller pieces so that you can swallow it. We call that a bolus when you swallow that bite-sized piece of food. And then you have chemical digestion. So you start chemical digestion in the mouth. In particular, you have amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks down starches. So it'll break down large carbohydrates into smaller starches, smaller sugars. Mucus is also really important. So this is in saliva as well. It's going to lubricate the food to make it easier for you to swallow. You're going to have certain buffers, and they're going to neutralize some of the acids in your food. And you have some antibacterial chemicals. And so those are going to kill some of the bacteria that enter your mouth with your food. So there's a lot of stuff in your spit. We go from the mouth down to the stomach. We need to pass through the epiglottis into the esophagus. So the epiglottis is this little flap that kind of acts as a gatekeeper between your digestive system and your respiratory system. So if you go into the trachea, which is the tube that's kind of in the front, closest to the front of your neck, or your throat, like in the front, you can feel that, and there's actually like rings of cartilage that keep that open, and that's for breathing. However, in the back, the esophagus, that's where food goes. So you want to make sure that food is going in the esophagus and air is going in the trachea. So if you want to feel the epiglottis working, put your hand on your throat, right where your Adam's apple would be, and swallow. That's the epiglottis moving back and forth, so closing over the trachea and preventing you from choking. It's basically a flat cartilage, and like I said, it closes the trachea and allows you to swallow. Food travels from there down to the esophagus, and it moves through something called peristalsis. So peristalsis is this like rhythmic contraction that allows food, and it helps things move through the digestive system. All right, so now we've gone from the mouth to the esophagus. We're going to go into the stomach. And the stomach's main function is to disinfect food, store food until you're ready to digest it fully in your small intestine, and it starts the digestion of protein. So the stomach has hydrochloric acid in it, which is around a pH of 2, which helps to kill bacteria. And then you also have this enzyme called pepsin, which specializes in breaking down proteins. Interestingly, if you think about it, the stomach is made out of protein. So if you have an enzyme that specializes in breaking down proteins, what stops the stomach from digesting itself? One of the things is this mucus that's secreted by the stomach cells to help protect the lining. Another really interesting fact is that pepsin is only activated when it's a very low acidic pH. So that's one of the ways that you can control when and where pepsin is digesting proteins. So the acid in your stomach is really there to help activate the pepsin, which digests protein. All right, so mouth to esophagus to stomach, and now we're going to move into the small intestine. But before we get there, just a fun fact, ulcers, we used to think they were caused by stress, but now we know that one of the causes, or one of the reasons that people sometimes get ulcers, is actually a bacterial infection called H. pylori. So if you look that up, there's some really interesting research on that. All right, into the small intestine. So the small intestine is really where all of the digestion, of chemical digestion of your food gets done. It's called the small intestine because it's small in diameter, but it's actually super, super long. And so this is where you digest carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids or fats. Basically, you have a bunch of organs, accessory organs, that dump enzymes into the small intestine, and they then will break down food. And then in the small intestine, you also have these little finger-like projections that help you absorb the food. the nutrients, so your sugars, your amino acids, and your fatty acids are all going to move into the body cells or into the circulatory system by diffusion and active transport. So the reason you have to digest your food is because you can't transport those large polymers. You have to break it down into monomers, the little pieces, in order to transport it through the body. This is really interesting kind of structure-function relationship in the small intestine. So if you were to kind of look at the lining of the small intestine, you'd see all these really cool folds. So they're like folds on folds on folds. And what they do is increase the surface area so you can get better absorption of nutrition. And those are called villi, and then on the villi you have microvilli. So another fun fact, the small intestine actually could be stretched out to be about 6 meters long, but if you looked at all the surface area, it covers about the size of a tennis court. All right, so now let's look at some of the organs that dump into the small intestine. So you have your pancreas and the liver. The pancreas, that little feather-like thing, is going to produce digestive enzymes that help digest proteins. Those are going to be trypsin and chymotrypsin. More enzymes that help digest starch, so amylase is one of those. And then enzymes that help digest lipids. Those would be lipases. It also releases buffers. So remember, your food is coming from the stomach, which is a super acidic environment. And so you have buffers that are going to neutralize that acid and actually make the pH slightly basic. So the small intestine, those enzymes, their optimal pH is at a slightly basic level. The liver is going to produce something called bile that helps break up fats. It's actually a physical digestion of fats. The gallbladder is where that bile gets stored. So the liver makes the bile, it gets stored in the gallbladder, and then when you have a fatty meal, the gallbladder will dump a whole bunch of this bile into the small intestine that helps break it up to make it easier to digest. Another fun fact, the iron that comes from bile in your red blood cells, when it oxidizes, it's one of the things that makes your poop brown. All right, so we went mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine. Now we go to the large intestine. And so the large intestine's major job is going to be to reabsorb water. You need a ton of water for this digestion. And without reabsorbing that, you would die of dehydration. So about 90% of the water that gets dumped in is reabsorbed here. If you don't absorb enough water, that's when you have diarrhea. That can actually be fatal. So you don't just feel like you're dying, you actually could die from that. And if you have too much water reabsorbed, that would be constipation. In your large intestine, you also have a ton of bacteria, and many of these bacteria are super helpful. So you have E. coli, which helps you digest cellulose. It also produces vitamins like vitamin B and vitamin K. So you have this symbiotic relationship. They also produce gases, so they can kind of make you a little stinky. So it's a give and take. And then you have poop. The appendix, we'll talk about that later. That's what we call a vestigial organ. We're not too sure exactly what that does. And then last but not least is the rectum. And what's left over, mainly cellulose. And that's like the roughage. But it's really important because it keeps everything moving. And then some masses of bacteria. So that's why you should wash your hands. And that's about it for me. If you guys have any questions, just make sure you write those down and we can address those when we get to class.